The winter of 1878 carved its name into the bones of the Adirondack Mountains with merciless precision. It was a season that would be remembered not just for the depth of its snows or the bite of its winds, but for the stories of those who survived it and those who didn't. This is the tale of Juanetta Tallfeather and her 7-year-old son, Ahanu, members of the Mohawk tribe who faced death in the unforgiving grip of that cruel winter, and of Jack Morgan, a solitary rancher whose act of compassion would forever alter the course of 3 lives bound together by circumstance and something far more profound than chance. Some stories are buried beneath the snow, waiting to be uncovered. This is one of them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The snowflakes fell like silent accusations from a slate-gray sky, each one adding to the smothering blanket that had already claimed the land. Juanetta Tallfeather stood at the edge of what remained of her village, her young son Ahanu's hand clutched tightly in hers, her breath forming clouds that dissipated too quickly in the bitter air. Behind them, smoke still rose from the charred remains of their longhouse, a thin, grey finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. The raid had come 3 days earlier. White settlers from the nearby town of Hawkrest, fueled by whiskey and long-harboured hatred. They had waited until the majority of the Mohawk hunters had departed on a winter expedition, leaving only the women, children, and elders. The settlers hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't expected Juanetta. She had fought with the fury of a mother bear, wielding her late husband's hunting knife with such ferocity that she had driven back 2 attackers, giving enough time for several of the children to flee into the forest. But in the chaos, flames had engulfed their homes, and when dawn broke, Juanetta found herself alone with Ahanu amidst the devastation. The tribal elders who had survived the attack had led the remaining Mohawk west toward distant relatives who might take them in before the worst of winter set in. But Juanetta had refused to leave. Not yet. Her sister Kinix and her newborn nephew had gone missing during the attack. For 2 days, Juanetta had searched, combing through the ruins, following tracks into the snow-laden forest until they vanished, calling names until her voice grew hoarse. Now, standing in the falling snow, she faced the cruel truth. Either Kinix and her baby had perished in the flames, or they had fled in another direction. Either way, with the storm intensifying, Juanetta could no longer risk Ahanu's life in the search. "Mother," Ahanu whispered, his voice small against the vastness of the white landscape. "Are we going to find the others now?" Juanetta knelt before her son, adjusting the 2 large deerskin coats she had salvaged from the ruins. His face was thin, his copper skin stretched taut over high cheekbones, a mirror of his father who had succumbed to a white man's disease 2 winters past. Hunger had already begun to hollow his cheeks, but his dark eyes remained fierce, trusting. "Yes," she replied, though she knew the tribe's trail would be covered by now, obliterated by the relentless snow. "We will find a new home." She gathered what little they had managed to salvage, a small bundle of jerky, a water skin, a blanket singed at the edges, her husband's knife, and a single beaded moccasin that had belonged to her sister, kept now as both a talisman and a promise. If Kinix lived, Juanetta would find her when spring melted the world again. The first day of their journey was cruel but navigable. Juanetta knew these forests, had hunted in them alongside her father and later her husband. She led Ahanu through secret places where the trees grew dense enough to provide some shelter from the wind, where forgotten caves might offer refuge for a night. But on the second day, the storm that had been threatening broke with apocalyptic force. The wind howled between the trees like a vengeful spirit, driving needles of ice that cut through their clothing and stung their exposed skin. The snow fell so thick and fast that Juanita could barely see 3 paces ahead. "Stay close," she instructed Ahanu, tying a length of leather between their wrists. "If you cannot see me, you can feel me." They trudged on, each step a battle against nature's fury. Juanita's legs burned with exhaustion, her lungs raw from the frigid air. Twice Ahanu stumbled and fell, and twice she pulled him up, brushing snow from his eyelashes, murmuring encouragement that the wind tore from her lips. By nightfall, they had covered less than half the distance Juanita had hoped. The meager shelter they found, a shallow depression beneath an outcropping of rock, was poor protection against the storm's wrath. Juanita wrapped the blanket around Ahanu, using her own body as a shield against the wind. "Tell me about the summer lands," Ahanu requested through chattering teeth, an old game between them. Juanita closed her eyes, summoning images of warmth and life to carry them through the bitterness of the night. "The summer lands are where the rivers run clear and swift," she began, her voice a low, steady rhythm against the storm's chaotic howl. "The fish leap so high they catch the sun on their scales. The meadows burst with flowers whose names have been forgotten by all but the oldest grandmothers. In the summer lands, the berries grow as big as your thumb, and they burst between your teeth, sweet as a promise kept." Ahanu nestled closer, his small body gradually relaxing against hers as she continued the litany of summer's bounties. Eventually, his breathing deepened into sleep, but Juanita remained awake, her eyes fixed on the swirling darkness beyond their shelter, her hand never straying far from the knife at her belt. The night seemed endless, a dark eternity punctuated by the wind's mournful keening. When dawn finally broke, it was as if the light had forgotten how to be golden. The world emerged in shades of grey and white, the sun a pale, indifferent disk behind layers of cloud. Juanita's limbs were stiff with cold, her fingers numb as she gently shook Ahanu awake. His eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to memory as the harsh reality of their situation settled once more upon his young shoulders. "I dreamed of the summer lands," he said softly. "Father was there, and Aunt connects with her baby." Juanita's throat tightened. "A good dream," she managed, helping him to his feet. "Perhaps a sign that our path is true." But as they emerged from their shelter, her heart sank. The storm had transformed the landscape overnight, erasing familiar landmarks beneath drifts that in some places reached higher than Ahanu's head. The path she had intended to follow was now indistinguishable from the rest of the snow-laden forest. Still, they could not remain. Their food was nearly gone, the jerky rationed to mere slivers that did little to quell the gnawing hunger. Juanita oriented herself as best she could, using the weak sun and her knowledge of the mountains to choose a direction. The third day of their journey was worse than the 2 before it combined. The temperature dropped sharply, and though the snowfall had lessened, a bitter wind scoured the landscape, lifting the top layer of snow into stinging clouds that reduced visibility to arm's length. By midday, Ahanu could no longer walk on his own. Juanita carried him, his arms wrapped around her neck, his face pressed against her shoulder. Her legs trembled with each step, muscles protesting, joints aching from cold and exertion. Yet she continued, one foot before the other, driven by a mother's desperate love and the stubborn resilience that had defined her life. "Sing me the hunting song," Ahanu murmured against her neck, his voice faint. Juanita's dry lips cracked as she forced them into motion, the ancient song emerging as little more than a croak, the words carried away by the wind almost before they left her mouth. But she continued, the familiar cadence a tether to hope as they struggled through the deepening afternoon. It was as the weak daylight began to fade that disaster struck. Juanita, her vision blurred by exhaustion and cold, failed to notice the treacherous slope ahead. The snow-covered ground gave way beneath her feet, sending them tumbling down a steep incline. She clutched Ahanu to her chest, trying to shield him as they rolled, snow filling her mouth, her nose, her eyes. When they finally came to rest at the bottom of the ravine, Juaneta's left ankle exploded with pain. She bit back a cry, gently setting Ahanu aside to examine the injury. Even through her leggings and moccasin, she could see the unnatural swelling. When she attempted to stand, the ankle buckled, unable to bear her weight. Panic, a luxury she had not allowed herself until now, threatened to overwhelm her. A night in this exposed ravine, with no shelter and temperatures still dropping, would likely be their last. "Mother." Ahanu's voice quavered, fear finally breaking through his stoic facade. "Are you hurt?" Juaneta forced a smile. "Only a little. We will rest here for a moment." She scanned their surroundings, desperation sharpening her senses. The ravine walls rose steeply on three sides, but to the east the slope seemed more gradual. If she could fashion a crutch from a branch, perhaps, they could climb out, find shelter before full darkness descended. "Ahanu," she said, keeping her voice steady, "I need you to be brave for me. Can you look for a strong branch about as tall as you are?" The boy nodded solemnly, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of this important task. He began to search the area, occasionally disappearing from view as he investigated promising mounds of snow. Juaneta used the time to bind her ankle as best she could, tearing a strip of fabric from the bottom of her already tattered dress. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain shooting up her leg, but she worked methodically, her fingers clumsy with cold. "Mother!" Ahanu's excited cry echoed off the ravine walls. "Mother, look!" Juaneta's head snapped up, expecting to see her son brandishing a suitable branch. Instead, Ahanu stood about 20 paces away, pointing excitedly at something beyond her. Line of sight. "Smoke! I see smoke!" Hope and suspicion warred within Juaneta's chest. Smoke meant fire, meant warmth and possibly food, but it also meant people, and after the raid on their village, Juaneta had good reason to fear strangers. Still, in their current state, exposure would claim them long before they reached the rest of their tribe. The smoke represented their only chance. "Help me up," she instructed, and Ahanu hurried to her side, his thin shoulder bracing her as she struggled to her feet. The pain nearly blinded her, but she gritted her teeth, leaning heavily on her son. "Show me." Ahanu guided her to where he had been standing, pointing eagerly toward a break in the trees, where indeed a thin column of smoke rose against the darkening sky. It wasn't far, perhaps a mile, but in Juaneta's condition it might as well have been 100. "We will go there," she decided, her voice firm despite the fear and pain churning inside her. "But we must be cautious. If it is a man from Harshest—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Young as he was, Ahanu understood the danger all too well. With painstaking slowness, they began to make their way toward the source of the smoke. Juaneta fashioned a crude crutch from a fallen branch, but it was Ahanu who truly supported her, his small body straining with the effort of helping her navigate the uneven terrain. The light faded rapidly, the forest plunging into a darkness so complete that they could barely make out the path before them. The wind picked up again, cutting through their inadequate clothing like a knife. Juaneta's strength was failing, her injured ankle a throbbing beacon of pain that threatened to consume her consciousness. "A little further," she urged, as much to herself as to Ahanu. "Just a little further." The boy's breathing had become labored, his steps increasingly unsteady. Juaneta knew he was reaching the limits of his endurance. If they didn't reach shelter soon, not even her body heat would be enough to protect him through the night. It was Ahanu who spotted the cabin first, his keen eyes picking out the squared shadows against the natural darkness of the forest. The smoke they had seen rose from a stone chimney, and a faint golden light spilled from a single window, a beacon in the endless night. Juaneta halted, pulling Ahanu close. "Remember," she whispered, We approach openly, but we remain alert. If I tell you to run, you run. Do not look back for me. Ahanu's face, barely visible in the darkness, was solemn as he nodded. Juanita knew he would not abandon her, no matter what she said, but the instruction was as much a ritual as a practical measure, an acknowledgement of the danger they faced. Together, they emerged from the tree line, making their slow, painful way toward the cabin. The snow in the clearing was deep, nearly reaching Ahanu's waist in places. Halfway across, Juanita's makeshift crutch sank deeply into a drift, throwing her off balance. She fell heavily, a cry of pain escaping her lips. Before she could stifle it, the cabin door flew open, spilling light across the snow. A tall figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, the unmistakable shape of a rifle in his hands. "Who's there?" The voice was deep, wary but not immediately hostile. "Show yourself." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Juanita pushed herself up onto her elbows, keeping Ahanu partially behind her, despite the boy's attempts to help her rise. "We mean no harm," she called, her voice cracking from disuse and cold. "Please, my son." The figure stepped forward, rifle still raised, moving cautiously into the island of light that surrounded the cabin. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard that obscured much of his face. His clothing was simple but sturdy, a wool coat, leather boots, a fur hat pulled low over his brow. "You're—" he began, then stopped, the rifle lowering slightly as he took in the sight before him. A Mohawk woman collapsed in the snow, a small boy at her side, both clearly at the end of their strength. "Indians," Juanita finished for him, her voice hard despite her vulnerability. "Yes. Will you shoot us, or will you let the cold do it for you?" For a long moment, the man said nothing, and Juanita felt Ahanu's small hand slip into hers, squeezing with what little strength he had left. She had gambled their lives on this approach, and now they would learn whether her choice would save them or doom them. Then, unexpectedly, the man lowered his rifle completely. Without a word, he strode forward through the snow, his long legs cutting a path to where they huddled. Up close, his eyes were startlingly blue against his weathered face, assessing rather than threatening. "You're hurt," he observed, gaze dropping to her poorly bound ankle. Juanita nodded warily. "We fell. My son needs shelter." The man's gaze shifted to Ahanu, who stared back with a mixture of fear and defiance that made Juanita's heart swell with pride, despite their desperate circumstances. "Jack Morgan," the man said abruptly, as if coming to a decision. "This is my ranch, what's left of it anyway." He glanced around at the snow-covered landscape, a flicker of something like grief crossing his features before he mastered it. Before Juanita could respond, he had handed the rifle to Ahanu, an astonishing gesture of trust, and bent to scoop her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Ahanu made a startled sound, stepping forward as if to defend his mother, but Juanita shook her head. "It's all right," she said softly in their native tongue. "He is helping us." As Jack carried her toward the cabin, Ahanu trailing behind with the rifle awkwardly clutched in his small hands, Juanita felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. They had found shelter, perhaps even salvation, but at what cost? What would this solitary rancher expect in return? And when the storm finally broke, what would become of them? The cabin door swung open, welcoming them into warmth and light, leaving these questions unanswered as the bitter wind at their backs. The cabin door closed behind them with a solid thud, sealing out the howling wind and enveloping them in a cocoon of unexpected warmth. Juanita blinked, her eyes adjusting to the sudden shift from darkness to the amber glow of lantern light. Jack Morgan carried her to a rough-hewn wooden chair near the hearth, setting her down with surprising gentleness before. turning to Ahanu, who still clutched the rifle awkwardly in his small hands. "You can put that down by the door, son," Jack said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Nobody's gonna need it tonight." Ahanu glanced at his mother, seeking guidance. Juanetta nodded once, and the boy carefully propped the rifle against the wall, his movements deliberate, as if handling something sacred. His eyes never left the rancher, tracking his every movement with the wariness of a young fox. Jack crouched before Juanetta, his weathered hands hovering above her injured ankle. "May I?" he asked, and there was something in his directness, his lack of condescension, that made Juanetta incline her head in permission. His touch was surprisingly delicate as he unwrapped her makeshift bandage, his brow furrowing as he examined the swollen flesh beneath. "Not broken," he pronounced after a moment. "Bad sprain, though. You're lucky. Another hour out there in this cold." He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. The three of them existed now in a fragile bubble of survival, aware of how easily it might have burst. "My name is Juanetta Tallfeather," she said formally, her English careful and precise despite her exhaustion. "This is my son Ahanu," Jack nodded, rising to his full height. Close up, in the lantern light, Juanetta could see that he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 35, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke more of sun and wind than age. His beard, though full, was neatly trimmed, and his clothes, while worn, were clean and well-mended. "You both need food and rest," he said, moving toward a cast-iron stove in the corner of the cabin. "I've got stew keeping warm. Nothing fancy, but it'll put some heat back in your bones." While Jack ladled thick, fragrant stew into wooden bowls, Juanita took stock of their surroundings. The cabin was small but solidly built, the logs chinked with clay to keep out drafts. A single room served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom, with a curtained-off section in one corner that she assumed held Jack's sleeping pallet. Shelves lined one wall, stocked with provisions, bags of flour and sugar, jars of preserved vegetables, dried herbs hanging in bunches. Tools hung from pegs, an axe, a saw, coils of rope. Everything had its place, nothing wasted, nothing frivolous. Ahanu edged closer to Juanetta, his eyes wide as he took in this alien environment. For a boy who had spent his entire life in a Mohawk village, with its longhouses and communal spaces, the isolated cabin with its solitary occupant must have seemed as foreign as the surface of the moon. "Here," Jack said, returning with 3 steaming bowls balanced expertly in his large hands. "Eat while it's hot." Juanita accepted a bowl with murmured thanks, then helped Ahanu settle beside her with his own portion. The first spoonful of stew nearly undid her composure. Rich broth, tender chunks of venison, roots, and wild onions. After days of near starvation, the flavors exploded on her tongue, intense enough to bring tears to her eyes. Beside her, Ahanu made a small sound of surprised pleasure, quickly suppressed as he remembered their situation. Juanetta laid a gentle hand on his shoulder, giving him permission to enjoy this unexpected bounty. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the occasional howl of wind against the cabin walls. Jack ate standing up, leaning against the rough-hewn table, his gaze occasionally drifting to the window where snow continued to accumulate on the sill. Something in his stance reminded Juanetta of a vigilant elk, alert even in repose, ready to move at the first sign of danger. When they had finished eating, Jack took their bowls and placed them in a wash basin. "You'll sleep there," he said, nodding toward a low pallet near the fire that Juanetta hadn't noticed before. "I'll take the loft." Juanetta followed his gesture upward, noting for the first time the ladder leading to a small sleeping platform tucked beneath the cabin's sloped roof. Relief washed through her. He was giving them space, privacy, a barrier between them as they slept. It was a small courtesy, but a significant one. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the food, for shelter." Jack shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Nobody survives these mountains alone in winter," he replied. "Not Indians, not white men, not even fools who think they can." There was something in his tone, a bitterness perhaps, or a lesson hard learned, but before Juanetta could decipher it, he had turned away, busying himself with banking the fire for the night. "There's water in that pitcher if you need it," he said over his shoulder. "Privy's out back, but with your ankle, you might want to use that chamber pot under the pallet till morning. I'll leave the curtain drawn." He paused, then added, "I'm a light sleeper. If you need anything, just call out." With that, he climbed the ladder to the loft, his movements efficient despite his size. A moment later, the lantern light dimmed as he blew out the flame, leaving only the fire's glow to illuminate the cabin. Juanetta helped Ahanu remove his outer clothing, now stiff with melted snow. She used a corner of a blanket to wipe his face clean, then tucked him into the pallet, sliding in beside him. His small body curled against hers instinctively, seeking warmth and comfort. She felt the tension gradually leave his muscles as the heat from the fire and the fullness in his belly lulled him toward sleep. "Is this the summer lands?" he whispered drowsily in their language. Juanetta pressed her lips to his forehead. "No, little one, but it is a safe harbor for now." The man with the sun-colored eyes, Ahanu murmured, "Is he a good spirit or a bad one?" Juanetta considered her answer carefully. "Neither," she decided. "He is just a man, and men can choose each day whether to do good or ill." Ahanu nodded, satisfied with this response, his eyelids growing heavy. "Today he chose good," he observed, before sleep claimed him completely. Juanetta lay awake long after her son's breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. Her ankle throbbed, a persistent reminder of their close brush with death. Above, she could hear the occasional creak of the loft's wooden planks as Jack shifted position. Was he also lying awake, wondering about the strangers he had welcomed into his home? Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Questions circled like crows in her mind. How long would the storm last? Could they impose on this man's hospitality? Until her ankle healed? And then what? The nearest Mohawk settlement was at least a week's journey on foot, and that was in good weather. With winter tightening its grip on the mountains, such a journey might be impossible until spring. And what of the men from Hawkrest? Would they come looking for survivors from the village? The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. If they found her and Ahanu here, they might not stop at burning a village this time. The weight of these thoughts finally pulled her down into a fitful sleep, punctuated by dreams of fire and falling snow. Morning arrived, with a quality of light so different from the previous days that Juanetta knew, even before opening her eyes, that the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's small windows, painting golden rectangles on the plank floor. The fire had burned down to embers, but the cabin remained surprisingly warm. She sat up carefully, mindful of her injured ankle and her still sleeping son. The pain had subsided somewhat overnight, though the joint remained swollen and discolored. Movement would be difficult for at least several days, she judged. A sound from above alerted her that Jack was awake. He descended the ladder with the same quiet efficiency he had shown the night before, nodding a silent greeting when he saw she was awake. "Storm's broken," he said, moving to the stove. 4 feet of new snow at least. We're not going anywhere for a while." The implications of this statement hung in the air between them. They were effectively stranded together, 3 strangers bound by circumstance and necessity. "Coffee," Jack offered, already measuring grounds into a battered pot. "Please," Juanetta accepted, though coffee was a luxury rarely afforded in her village. She had tasted it only a handful of times during trading expeditions with her father. Jack worked methodically, stoking the fire in the stove, setting water to boil, mixing a simple batter for what looked like johnny cakes. His movements suggested long practice at self-sufficiency, a life shaped by solitude and routine. "You mentioned this was your ranch," Juanetta said, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Ahanu. "I saw no livestock." A muscle twitched in Jack's jaw, his hands stilling momentarily before resuming their work. "Lost most of my cattle in the early snows," he said after a moment. "The rest I sold before winter set in properly. This cabin's all that's left now." There was a story there, Juanetta sensed, but she did not press. Everyone had their wounds, their losses. Privacy was a courtesy one extended even in close quarters. "I will leave as soon as my ankle allows," she said instead. "We will find our people." Jack glanced at her over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Your village? It's gone?" Juaneta's throat tightened. "Burned," men from a settlement called Harshest. Something flickered across Jack's face. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. "Harshest is the nearest town," he said slowly. 15 miles east as the crow flies. Longer, by trail. You know of it? I trade there, or did." He turned back to the stove, flipping a johnny cake with practiced ease. "Haven't been since the first snowfall. They're not fond of solitary folk there. Like their community is tight, their opinions tighter." A diplomatic answer, Juanetta noted. He hadn't spoken against the town, but neither had he defended it. She wondered where his loyalties might lie if forced to choose. Ahanu stirred beside her, his eyes opening to the strange surroundings with momentary confusion before memory returned. He sat up quickly, alert and wary despite the comfort of their shelter. "Good morning, young man," Jack said, his deep voice gentler than it had been. "Hungry?" Ahanu looked to his mother for guidance. Juanetta nodded encouragingly, and the boy responded with a cautious, "Yes, sir." Jack's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Just Jack will do. Sir was my father, and a sterner man never walked these mountains." He brought them plates of johnny cakes, drizzled with maple syrup, another luxury that made Juanita wonder about this solitary rancher and his strange abundance in the midst of winter isolation. The coffee, when it came, was strong and bitter, but warmed her from the inside out. After breakfast, Jack attended to Juaneta's ankle with surprising skill, washing it carefully before applying a poultice of herbs she recognized, yarrow and comfrey, steeped in hot water and bound with clean strips of linen. "Where did you learn this?" she asked as he worked. "My mother," he replied without looking up. "She was a midwife before she married my father, knew all manner of cures and treatments." "She taught you well," she tried. A shadow crossed his face. "I wasn't always the most attentive student." The rest of the day established a pattern that would define their first week in the cabin. Jack tended to the necessary chores, bringing in firewood from the covered stack against the cabin wall, checking his trap lines in the nearby forest, melting snow for water. Juaneta, confined by her injury, took over preparation of meals from the surprisingly varied provisions. Ahanu, initially subdued and watchful, gradually began to explore the cabin's interior, examining tools and possessions with curious fingers. Jack seemed unbothered by the boy's interest, occasionally pausing to explain the function of an unusual implement or the story behind a particular item. On the third day, Juaneta discovered a shelf of books tucked in a corner, a dozen or so volumes, their spines cracked with use. She ran her fingers over the titles, recognizing some from her limited exposure to white men's literature. "You read?" Jack asked, catching her interest as he entered with an armload of firewood. "Some," Juaneta admitted. Education had been valued. In her family, her father believing that understanding the white man's ways was essential for survival in a changing world. "My father traded with a missionary who taught the children in our village," Jack nodded, unsurprised. "My mother insisted on books, even out here, said the mind needed feeding as much as the body." He hesitated, then added, "You're welcome to them, if you'd like." That evening, after Ahanu had fallen asleep, Juaneta opened, A slim volume of poetry, the pages illuminated by firelight. Across the room, Jack cleaned his rifle, the familiar rhythm of the task a counterpoint to the silence. It was the first time since their arrival that they had occupied the same space without the immediate demands of survival between them. "Why did you help us?" Juanetta asked suddenly, the question that had lingered in her mind finally finding its voice. Jack's hands stilled on the rifle barrel. He didn't look up, but she could see the consideration in his profile, the weighing of words. "6 years ago," he said finally, "my wife and daughter were caught in an early blizzard while visiting her sister in Hawkrest. They tried to make it. Back here." He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing beneath his beard. "They were found when the snow melted in spring. 1/2 mile from this cabin." The revelation hung in the air, heavy with implication. Juanetta thought of Ahanu, of how easily they might have perished in the storm, of how Jack must have seen, in their plight, an echo of his own loss. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Jack nodded. Once acknowledgement rather than acceptance. "Nobody should die alone in the cold," he said, resuming his work on the rifle. "Not if there's a hand that could have helped." The days blended together, marked by the slow healing of Juanita's ankle and the gradual easing of tensions within the cabin. Jack proved to be a man of few words, but considerate actions, ensuring the water bucket was always filled, fashioning a crude crutch for Juanita when she insisted on testing her weight on the injured limb, showing Ahanu how to set simple snares for rabbits. A week into their stay, Jack returned from checking his trap lines with a small bundle wrapped in burlap. "Found something that might interest you," he said, setting the package on the table. Inside was a collection of wild herbs and plants, carefully harvested despite the snow cover, wintergreen pine needles, the inner bark of birch trees. Ingredients for medicines Juanita had feared she would have to do without. "You know our healing ways?" she asked, surprised. Jack shook his head. "Just what grows where. Figured you'd know what to do with them." The gesture touched her more deeply than she had expected. It was one thing to provide shelter and food, basic humanity that many might offer in dire circumstances. It was another entirely to observe, to understand, to anticipate needs unspoken. That evening, Juanita showed Ahanu how to prepare the herbs, continuing his education as she would have in their village. Jack watched from his place by the fire, asking occasional questions that revealed genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. "My grandfather always said the Mohawk were the best healers among the 6 nations," he remarked, whittling a piece of pine into what looked like the beginnings of a toy horse. Juanetta glanced up sharply. "You know of the 6 nations?" Jack nodded. "My father trapped and traded with the Seneca before he settled here. Spoke their language better than English, according to my mother." A wry smile briefly crossed his features. He wasn't exactly welcomed in Hawkrest either. Another piece of the puzzle that was Jack Morgan fell into place. His comfort with their presence, his lack of the typical prejudice Juanita had come to expect from white settlers, these were not accidents of character, but the product of a life lived on the boundaries between worlds. As Juanita's ankle improved, she began to contribute more actively to the daily routines of the cabin. She mended clothing that had been set aside for repair, rendered fat into soap using Jack's mother's recipe, wove baskets from supple pine roots that Ahanu proudly collected from beneath the snow. A quiet harmony developed, 3 solitary souls, finding unexpected companionship in shared tasks and silent evenings. Yet beneath this calm surface, Juanetta remained acutely aware of the temporary nature of their arrangement. The snow would eventually melt, decisions would need to be made, and there was Hawkrest to consider. The settlement lay quiet in the grip of winter, but spring would bring renewed activity, including potentially expeditions to ensure that no survivors remained from the Mohawk village. These concerns weighed on her as she stood at the cabin window one afternoon, watching Ahanu help Jack clear a path to the small shed where firewood was stored. The boys' laughter floated through the glass, a sound she had feared she might never hear again after the burning of their village. Ahanu was flourishing despite their circumstances, or perhaps because of them. The secure routine of the cabin, the attention of two adults focused solely on his welfare, the adventure of learning new skills from Jack, all had transformed her solemn, cautious son into a more confident, expressive child. Would that change when they rejoined what remained of their tribe? Would the grief and displacement that surely marked the survivors cast a shadow over Ahanu's newfound resilience? And yet, what choice did they have? They could not impose indefinitely on Jack's hospitality, nor could they survive alone. Her reflection was interrupted by a sound that froze the blood in her veins, the distant but unmistakable baying of hounds, hunting dogs. And in these mountains, in winter, there was only one quarry that would justify such an expedition. Jack heard it too. His head snapped up, his body tensing as the sound came again, closer this time. Without a word, he scooped Ahanu into his arms and strode toward the cabin, his expression grim. "Inside," he said tersely as he reached the door. "Now." Juanita's heart hammered against her ribs as Jack set Ahanu down and moved swiftly to the rifle propped by the door. "Men from Hawkrest?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Jack nodded, checking the rifle's loading with practiced movements. "Hunting party sounds like they don't usually come this far west. They're looking for survivors," Juanita said, gathering Ahanu close. "For us." The boy trembled against her, old enough to understand the danger but too young to hide his fear. Jack's gaze flicked to him, then back to Juanita, resolution hardening his features. "Get your things," he said quietly. "There's a root cellar beneath the cabin, trapdoors under that bearskin rug." He nodded toward the corner of the room. "You would hide us?" Juanita asked, surprise momentarily overriding her fear. Jack's expression darkened. "What happened to your village? That wasn't justice. That was murder." He moved to the window, peering out at the tree line. "I won't be party to more of it." The baying came again, close enough now that they could hear the enthusiastic yips that indicated the dogs had caught a scent. Time was running. "Short, go!" Jack urged. "I'll deal with them." Juanita hesitated only a moment before pulling back the rug to reveal the trapdoor Jack had described. Cool, musty air wafted up from the darkness below. She helped Ahanu down the rough wooden steps, then paused, looking back at the rancher who had saved them twice now. "Jack," she said, his name unfamiliar on her tongue. "Thank you." He met her gaze for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his features. Then he nodded once, sharply, and turned back to the window where the first silhouettes of men and dogs were emerging from the forest's edge. Juanita descended into the darkness of the root cellar, pulling the trapdoor closed above her. She gathered Ahanu close, feeling his heart race against her chest like a captured bird's. Above them, the floorboards creaked as Jack moved to meet the approaching threat. The hunt had found them. But this time, they weren't alone. The root cellar was a realm of damp earth and forgotten harvest. A few wrinkled potatoes, onions suspended in braids from the low ceiling, jars of preserves lining rough-hewn shelves. Juanita and Ahanu huddled in its furthest corner, enveloped in darkness save for thin ribbons of light seeping through the floorboards above. Up there, Jack Morgan was about to face men who had burned a village and slaughtered its inhabitants. Men whose hatred ran so deep they would brave winter's wrath to ensure no survivors remained to tell the tale. Ahanu pressed closer, his small body tense with fear. "Will they kill him too?" he whispered in their language, his voice barely audible even in the confines of the cellar. Juanita stroked his hair, choosing honesty over false comfort. "I don't know." But he is clever, and this is his territory. She tilted her head toward the ceiling, where heavy footsteps now traversed the cabin floor. Listen and learn how a fox faces wolves. Above them, the cabin door creaked open. A blast of cold air swept across the floorboards before the door thumped shut again. "Morgan," a voice greeted, too muffled by distance and wood for Juanita to discern any emotion beyond the obvious, wariness perhaps, or forced joviality. "Paxton," Jack's reply came, measured and neutral. "You're a long way from Hawkrest." Shuffling sounds suggested multiple men entering the cabin, stamping snow from boots, crowding the small space with unwelcome presence. "Been tracking a party of Indians," another voice said, higher-pitched, eager. "Dogs caught their scent heading this way." "Is that so?" Jack's tone remained even, unperturbed. The floorboards creaked as he moved toward the stove, Juanetta guessed by the metallic clink that followed. "Coffee?" A pause, then a general murmur of acceptance. Juanetta could picture the scene. Jack, unhurried and deliberate, setting water to boil as if this were any ordinary social call, the hunters eyeing their surroundings, searching for signs of the prey. They sought. "Have you seen any sign of them?" The first voice, Paxton, asked directly. "Mohawk. Woman and child, we think." "That's specific tracking," Jack observed mildly. "Usually you boys just say Indians and leave it at that." A scoffing sound. "These ones we're sure of, survivors from that nest up by Eagle Ridge." "The village you burned," Jack said, the words not a question but a statement, devoid of judgment yet hanging in the air like an accusation nonetheless. Silence stretched taut for several heartbeats. "Was justice," a third voice asserted, deeper than the others, authoritative. "They raided Thompson's cattle twice this winter, killed his boy when he tried to stop them." Below, Juanita's breath caught sharply. An outright lie. Her people had never raided the settlers' herds, had never harmed their children. But who remained alive to challenge this falsehood? "Odd," Jack replied, the single word containing dangerous undercurrents. "Last I heard, Thompson's boy caught a fever and died before the first snow. Tragic, but hardly murder." "You calling me a liar, Morgan?" The third voice rose, hostile. "Just telling you what I heard in town, before the passes closed," Jack countered, unruffled. "But then, I don't get all the news out here alone." The tension was palpable even from below, radiating through the floorboards. Juanetta held Ahanu tighter, sensing the precarious moment. One misstep, one wrong word, and blood would stain the cabin floor, Jack's and then inevitably theirs. "Coffee's ready," Jack announced, breaking the charged silence. The mundane declaration seemed to diffuse some of the hostility. Shuffling and the scrape of mugs followed. "About those Indians," Paxton circled back. "Dogs tracked them almost to your door." "Storm confuses sense," Jack said dismissively. "I've seen those hounds of yours chase their own tails in circles after fresh snowfall." "Even so, do you mind if we take a look around?" The third man again, challenging. "My home isn't open for inspection, Aldridge," Jack replied, his tone hardening. "For the first time. Never has been. You protecting something, Morgan, or someone?" A loaded pause. Juanita could almost see Jack's expression, measuring, calculating, deciding how much to reveal and how much to conceal. "Only my privacy," he said finally, "and the sanctity of my hearth, which, if I recall, was a principle you championed loudly. Enough at the town meeting last spring, when Mayor Collins suggested property checks for untaxed spirits." A grudging chuckle from one of the men broke the tension. "He's got you there, Aldridge. Can't have it both ways." "Look," Jack continued, his voice shifting to something almost conciliatory. "I've seen no Indians, Mohawk or otherwise, but I did. He found tracks yesterday, heading northwest toward the high pass. If your quarry had any sense, they'd be trying to reach the Seneca settlements on the far side of the ridge." "In this weather?" Paxton sounded skeptical. "With a child?" Desperation. Makes fools of us all, Jack said softly, even those with good reason to run. Something in his tone, a subtle emphasis perhaps, or the barest hint of rebuke, seemed to register with the hunters. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted once more. We should move on if we're to reach the pass before sundown, Aldridge decided. Morgan, you do well to report any sightings immediately. These Indians are dangerous, whatever you might think of our methods. I'll keep that in mind, Jack replied non-committally. The floorboards creaked again as the men moved toward the door. Strange life you've made out here, Morgan, Paxton observed, his voice receding. Man ought to have company, especially in winter. I have all the company I require, Jack answered, and Juanita heard the door open, ushering the intruders back into the cold. The graves of your wife and daughter don't count. Aldridge's parting shot was deliberately cruel, delivered from the safety of the threshold. The living need the living, Morgan. Remember that, when you're lying awake, listening to the wind. The door closed with finality. Juanita and Ahanu remained motionless in the darkness, scarcely breathing, as heavy footsteps circled the cabin once before crunching away into the snow. The baying of hounds resumed, growing fainter as the hunting party moved toward the northwest path Jack had suggested. Still, they waited. Minutes stretched long, marked only by their shallow breaths and the distant tick of cooling wood in the stove above. Finally, the trapdoor lifted, flooding the root cellar with light. Jack's bearded face appeared in the opening, his expression grave. "They're gone," he said simply, extending a hand to help them up. "For now." Juanita emerged first, then lifted Ahanu from the darkness. The boy blinked in the sudden brightness, his face pale but composed. They stood in awkward silence, the reality of what had transpired, what Jack had risked, hanging between them like an unspoken oath. "They lied," Ahanu said suddenly, his child's directness cutting through pretense. "About the cattle, about the boy." Jack nodded, meeting the child's gaze with the respect one warrior accords another. "Yes," he agreed. "They did." "Why?" Ahanu persisted, genuine confusion creasing his brow. "Why would they need to lie if they were right to attack our village?" Jack glanced at Juanita, a silent query whether he should answer with hard truth or gentler evasion. She inclined her head, granting permission. Her son was young, but the world had already stripped away his innocence. Better he understand it than be blindsided by its cruelties again. "Because, Ahanu," Jack said carefully, crouching to the boy's level, "men need to believe they're in the right, even when they're in the wrong. Especially then." He sighed, searching for words a child might grasp. "It's easier to hate someone if you can convince yourself they deserve it." Ahanu considered this, his dark eyes solemn. "But you didn't believe their lies." "No," Jack agreed. "I didn't." "Why not?" Jack smiled faintly. "Because I've lived long enough to know that most men, regardless of their skin color or their customs, want the same things. Peace, safety for their families, enough food to fill their bellies. Violence usually comes from fear, not evil." It was perhaps the longest speech Juanita had heard from the taciturn rancher, and something in his words, their quiet wisdom, their lack of bitterness despite his own losses, touched her deeply. "You risked much for us today," she said softly. "If they had found us—" "They didn't," Jack cut her off, straightening, "and they won't be back this way for some time. The pass I sent them toward is snowed in until spring. They'll figure that out soon enough and return to Hawkrest empty-handed." Juanita nodded, relief washing through her. Yet with it came a new awareness. Their sanctuary was not as isolated as she had believed. The world outside, with its hatreds and dangers, could intrude at any moment. "Perhaps we should leave," she suggested, though the thought of venturing into the winter wilderness again made her heart clench. "Find another path to the Seneca settlements," Jack's brow furrowed. "With a half-healed ankle in 3 feet of snow, That would be suicide. He shook his head decisively. You're safer here until spring thaw, at least. His certainty should have reassured her, but instead it underscored the reality of their situation. They were dependent on this man, this stranger, in ways that went beyond food and shelter. Their very lives were in his hands. Why? She asked, echoing her son's earlier directness. Why risk yourself for people you don't know? Jack's gaze shifted to the window, to the pristine whiteness beyond where the hunter's tracks were already being erased by gently falling snow. For a long moment, he was silent. Maybe I'm tired of being alone, he said finally, so quietly she almost didn't hear. Or maybe I just need to believe there's still some good left in this world, that not everything ends in loss. He turned back. To them, his expression unreadable. Does the reason matter? Before Juanetta could respond, Ahanu stepped forward, placing his small hand on Jack's much larger one. Thank you, the boy said in careful English, the words deliberate and sincere. Something flickered in Jack's eyes, surprise perhaps, or the ghost of an emotion long buried. He nodded once, acceptance of the gratitude and all it implied. You're welcome, he replied, the simple phrase carrying the weight of covenant. In the days that followed, their life in the cabin underwent a subtle but significant transformation. The boundaries that had previously defined their coexistence, polite distances maintained, spaces respected, routines separate though parallel, began to blur and shift. Necessity had made them housemates. The hunter's visit had made them allies. Now something more complex was emerging, tentative as spring's first shoots through winter soil. Jack taught Ahanu to read English using his mother's treasured books, the boy's quick mind absorbing new knowledge with astonishing speed. In return, Ahanu shared Mohawk stories and words, Jack repeating the unfamiliar syllables with careful attention to their cadence and meaning. Juanetta found herself drawn into these exchanges, correcting pronunciations, explaining cultural context, laughing despite herself at Jack's occasionally mangled attempts at her language. His willingness to learn, to understand rather than simply tolerate, was unexpected and disarming. My father used to say that every language is a different way of seeing the world, Jack remarked one evening as they sat by the fire, Ahanu already asleep in the pallet nearby. He spoke Seneca fluently and claimed it changed him, made him see things differently than when he thought in English. Your father was wise, Juanetta said, her hands busy with a basket she was weaving. Our words shape more than our speech. Jack nodded thoughtful. He would have liked you, he said after a pause, both of you. The simple statement carried more weight than its few words suggested, an acknowledgement of connection, of value beyond utility or circumstance. As January yielded to February, their routines merged and evolved. Jack taught Juanetta to use his rifle, insisting that everyone in the mountains should know how to hunt and defend themselves. Her natural aptitude surprised them both. By her third lesson, she was hitting targets with consistent accuracy. You're a quick study, Jack observed, watching her reload with practiced movements. We are not so different, your people and mine, she replied. We both understand that survival requires skill, not just strength. Jack's mouth quirled in what had become a more frequent expression, not quite a smile, but a softening of his usually stern countenance. Wisdom my father would have appreciated, he said. My mother too, though she'd have phrased it differently. What was she like? Juanetta asked, curious about the woman who had shaped this unusual man. Your mother. Jack's gaze turned distant, focused on memories rather than the present. Stubborn, he said finally. Educated. She was a school teacher in Albany before she met my father. Everyone thought she was mad to marry a trapper and move to the wilderness, but she never regretted it. At least, she never let on if she did. And your wife? The question slipped out before Juanetta could reconsider its propriety. For a moment, she thought she had overstepped. Jack's expression closed, the familiar guardedness returning like a shutter drawn across an open window. Then, unexpectedly, it cleared again. Sarah was quiet, he said softly, gentle in ways I never managed to be. She saw beauty in things most people overlooked, the pattern of frost on a window, the way sunlight filtered through leaves. His voice caught slightly. Our daughter Elizabeth was like her. They used to collect wildflowers together, press them between the pages of books. The pain in his voice was still raw, undiminished by years. Juanetta recognized it as kin to her own grief for her husband, for her sister who might still be lost in the wilderness, for her people scattered or slain. The Mohawk believe that those who have walked on continue to guide us, she offered. Their spirits remain close, especially in places they loved. Jack considered this, his gaze drifting to the window where darkness pressed against the glass. Is that a comfort, he asked finally, or does it make the loss harder to bear? Both, Juanetta admitted, like most true things in this world. February brought a temporary thaw, a deceptive breath of warmth that melted the top layer of snow during daylight hours, only to refreeze it at night into treacherous sheets of ice. The respite allowed Jack to venture further from the cabin, checking trap lines that had been inaccessible during the deepest snows and replenishing their dwindling supply of meat. Juanetta used the opportunity to test her fully healed ankle, exploring the immediate surroundings of the cabin with a hanu at her side. They discovered a small stream, still flowing beneath a shell of ice, and collected watercress growing in its sheltered banks, a welcome addition to their winter diet. They found Jack's woodshed, nearly depleted after months of constant fires, and the small cemetery where two simple wooden crosses marked the graves of his wife and daughter. A hanu placed pine cones at the base of each cross, a Mohawk gesture of respect for the departed. When Jack returned and saw them, he said nothing, but his hand lingered on the boy's shoulder for a moment longer than usual. That night, as Jack played checkers with a hanu, using carved wooden pieces and a board drawn on a scrap of leather, Juanetta felt a strange contentment settle over her, a sense of rightness that had been absent since the burning of her village. Here, in this isolated cabin with this solitary white man, she and her son had found not just safety, but something approaching harmony. The thought both comforted and troubled her. Spring would eventually come, bringing with it decisions that could not be postponed indefinitely. The remaining members of her tribe, if they had survived the winter, would be regrouping, perhaps even returning to the site of their village to salvage what could be reclaimed. Her duty, to her people, to her heritage, to a hanu's future, lay with them. Yet the prospect of leaving the cabin, of returning to a life shaped by the realities of being Mohawk in a world increasingly dominated by white settlers, filled her. With a dread she was reluctant to examine too closely. "Your move," Jack's voice interrupted her reverie. She glanced up to find both man and boy watching her, their game apparently concluded. "I was not playing," she said, confused. "You are now," Jack replied, gesturing to the board where the pieces had been reset. "A hanu says you're a formidable opponent." The boy grinned, a flash of white teeth in his copper face. "I told him you always beat father, even when he tried to cheat." The casual mention of her late husband, spoken without the edge of grief that had previously accompanied such references, caught Juanetta off guard. When had a hanu begun to remember his father with joy rather than sorrow? And when had Jack become someone the boy felt comfortable sharing such memories with? The transformation had been so gradual she had failed to mark its progress, like watching a sapling grow. The daily changes imperceptible until suddenly one realized a tree stood where once was only a tender shoot. "Very well," she said, moving to join them at the table, "but do not expect mercy simply because you are new to the game." Jack's eyes crinkled at the corners, the closest he came to outright laughter. "I wouldn't dream of it." The game was evenly matched, Jack's methodical strategy against Juanetta's more intuitive approach. Ahanu watched intently, offering occasional commentary in a mixture of English and Mohawk that neither adult corrected. When Jack finally conceded defeat, it was with good grace and a demand for a rematch the following evening. Later, after Ahanu had fallen asleep and Jack had climbed to his loft, Juanita sat by the dying fire, contemplating the strange turns of fate that had brought them to this moment. In the Mohawk tradition, nothing happened without purpose. Each joy, each sorrow, each seemingly random encounter was part of a greater design, a path the Creator had set before each soul. What then was the purpose of their survival? Of Jack? Morgan's intervention in their desperate flight? What design could be served by this unlikely alliance? The fire popped and settled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind whispered secrets to the pines. Inside, 3 separate hearts beat in the rhythm of shared existence, each bearing its own wounds, its own hopes, its own unspoken questions about what lay ahead when winter finally released its grip on the land. Juanita stirred the embers with a stick, watching the glow brighten then fade. Spring would come, decisions would be made, paths would diverge or converge. But for now, in this cabin wrested from wilderness, they had found something rare and precious, a shelter not just for bodies, but for souls. A scuffing sound from above drew her attention. Jack leaned over the edge of the loft, his expression concerned in the faint firelight. "Trouble sleeping?" he asked softly. Juanita shook her head. "Just thinking." He nodded, understanding without explanation. "Dawn comes early," he reminded her gently. "Rest while you can." Simple advice, pragmatic, as always. Yet in it, Juanita heard what remained unsaid. Concern for her well-being, respect for her private thoughts, the quiet acknowledgement of shared burden. "Good night, Jack," she replied, banking the fire for the night. "Good night, Juanita," he answered, her name in his mouth no longer foreign but familiar, almost cherished. She settled beside Ahanu on their pallet, drawing the blankets close against the night's chill. Above, she heard Jack shift position, the wooden planks creaking softly. Between them, the air held conversations yet to happen, truths yet to be acknowledged, possibilities as fragile and potent as spring's first buds beneath winter snow. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the cabin's sturdy frame, a reminder of the world beyond their sanctuary, waiting to reclaim them when winter's respite ended. March arrived with deceptive gentleness, warm winds that whispered promises of spring while winter still held the land in its grip. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of earth that had lain hidden for months. Ice cracked on the nearby stream, surrendering to the strengthening sun. The world was awakening, stirring with new possibilities. Inside Jack's cabin, the atmosphere had shifted too. What had begun as an arrangement of necessity had blossomed into something none of them had anticipated. Meals were shared with easy conversation, evenings passed with stories and games, mornings greeted with genuine warmth. Ahanu flourished under Jack's patient tutelage, his English improving daily, his natural curiosity finding fertile ground in the rancher's practical knowledge. Juanita watched her son's transformation with a mixture of pride and unease. Pride in his resilience, unease at how easily he had adapted to this new existence, as if the life they had led before was already fading from his memory. For her part, Juanita found herself drawn to Jack in ways that both surprised and troubled her. His quiet strength, his principled actions, his respect for her autonomy despite their circumstances, these qualities resonated deeply. More than once, she had caught herself watching him as he worked, noting the careful precision of his hands, the thoughtful set of his mouth, the rare but transformative nature of his smile. Such thoughts were dangerous, she knew. When spring fully arrived, choices would have to be made. Her people, those who survived, would be counting on every member of the tribe to help rebuild. Ahanu needed to grow up knowing his heritage, his language, his traditions. And Jack had his own life, his own land, his own ghosts to lay, to rest. Still, as the days lengthened and the promise of spring grew more insistent, Juanetta found it increasingly difficult to imagine leaving the sanctuary they had created together. The day everything changed began ordinarily enough. Jack had gone to check his trap lines, taking advantage of the milder weather to venture farther than he had in weeks. Juanetta and Ahanu remained at the cabin, the boy practicing his letters at the table while she rendered a rabbit skin into supple leather, a skill she had insisted on teaching Jack when she'd seen his clumsy attempts at tanning. Mid-morning, Ahanu glanced up from his work, his head tilted like a bird, listening for distant thunder. "Horses," he said simply, his senses attuned to nuances Juanetta had missed. She paused, listening intently, and was rewarded with the faint sound of hoofbeats approaching through melting snow. Visitors in these mountains were rare, especially at winter's end, when trails remained treacherous. Jack had not mentioned expecting anyone. "Go to the root cellar," she instructed, wiping her hands clean. Quickly, Ahanu hesitated, reluctance clear in his expression. At 7, nearly 8 now, as he reminded her frequently, he considered himself too old to hide while his mother faced danger. "I will follow if necessary," she assured him. "But first, I must see who comes." This compromise satisfied him enough to obey, though his movements were deliberately slow as he disappeared through the trapdoor. Juanetta closed it securely, replacing the bearskin rug before moving to the window. 3 riders approached from the east, the direction of Hawk Rest. Even at a distance, she could tell they were not the same men who had come hunting before. These riders moved with the confident ease of those who knew their destination and purpose, not the cautious advance of trackers following uncertain prey. Juanetta retreated from the window, considering her options. She could join Ahanu in the cellar, but that would leave the cabin apparently empty, possibly inviting the strangers to enter and discover their presence anyway. She could attempt to flee into the forest, but that might only lead the riders to pursue her, potentially straight to Jack. A third option presented itself, audacious but perhaps the most practical. She could simply meet these visitors openly. After all, not every white person from Hawkrest was necessarily an enemy, and if they were, better to face them directly than be caught hiding like prey. Decision made, Juanetta quickly adjusted her appearance. She donned one of Jack's shirts over her dress, large enough to conceal most of her distinctly Mohawk clothing, and pulled her long hair back, securing it at the nape of her neck. With her complexion and features, she could not pass as white, but she might at least present a less immediately alarming figure to whoever approached. By the time hoofbeats entered the clearing, Juanetta was calmly seated at the table, a cup of coffee before her, Jack's rifle propped against the wall within easy reach, but not immediately threatening. She had sent up silent prayers to both the Christian God Jack sometimes invoked and the great spirit of her ancestors. Whatever happened next would unfold according to powers beyond her control, but she would face it with dignity. The cabin door opened without a knock, revealing a man in his 50s, silver-haired but robust, dressed in the practical garb of a frontier doctor, clean but worn, functional rather than fashionable. Behind him stood 2 younger men, similarly attired, but bearing the unmistakable family resemblance of father and sons. The older man's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise at the sight of Juanetta. "Well," he said after a moment, recovering his composure, "you're not Jack Morgan." "No," Juanetta agreed calmly, her hands flat on the table to demonstrate she intended no sudden moves. "He is checking his trap lines. He will return soon." The man stepped further into the cabin, studying her with open curiosity rather than hostility. "I'm Doc Harris," he introduced himself. "These are my sons, Thomas and Benjamin. We make rounds to the outlying homesteads when the weather permits, checking on folks who've been isolated all winter." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. Jack didn't mention he had company. He had no way to send a word, Juanetta replied, choosing her words carefully. "I am Juanita. My son and I were caught in the winter storms. Mr. Morgan provided shelter. It was the truth, if not the entire truth." She watched the doctor's face closely, searching for signs of the prejudice and hatred she had encountered in other settlers. Instead, she saw only thoughtful consideration. "Juanita," he repeated. "Mohawk name, isn't it?" She nodded cautiously. "From the village at Eagle Ridge?" The direct question sent a chill through her veins, but lying seemed both futile and potentially dangerous. "Yes," Doc Harris sighed heavily, removing his hat and running a hand through his silver hair. "I thought as much. You should know, then, that you're taking a considerable risk being here so openly. There are men in Hawkrest who would—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Juanita's throat tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I am aware," she said simply. One of the younger men, Thomas, she thought, shifted uncomfortably. "Pa, we should go. This isn't our business." Doc Harris shook his head. "Thomas, when men burn a village and hunt survivors, it becomes everyone's business." He turned back to Juanita. "I was away when it happened, delivering twins at a farm 20 miles west. By the time I returned, it was too late to stop it, too late to do anything but tend to those few settlers who'd been injured in the attack, and to declare my people dead without examining them," Juanetta said quietly, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. The doctor flinched as if struck. "Some crimes have no remedy," he acknowledged. "I can only say it wasn't a unanimous decision. There are those in Hawkrest who were horrified by what happened. Just not enough to prevent it," Juanetta observed. Before Doc Harris could respond, the trapdoor in the floor creaked open, and a Hanu's dark head emerged. Curiosity had evidently overcome caution. The boy climbed out, moving to stand beside his mother with a boldness that made Juanita's heart swell with pride, even as fear clutched at her throat. "You must be the son," Doc Harris said gently, his expression softening. "What's your name, young man?" "Ahanu," the boy replied clearly, his English showing the results of Jack's careful teaching. "It means he laughs in our language." "A good name," the doctor approved. "The world needs more laughter." He crouched to the boy's level, his manner unchanged by Ahanu's obvious heritage. "I'm Dr. Harris. I've been Jack's friend for many years." Juanetta watched this exchange with cautious hope. If this man truly was Jack's friend, perhaps he could be trusted. Still, years of experience had taught her the fickleness of white men's attitudes toward her people, how quickly courtesy could turn to cruelty, tolerance to violence. "You said men are still hunting survivors," she said, drawing the doctor's attention back to the matter at hand. "How many? And do they know of Jack's involvement?" Doc Harris straightened, his expression grave. "A faction led by Aldridge and Paxton, about 6 men total, dangerous men, especially Aldridge. He's been bitter since losing his land claim to the north. Blames everyone but himself, Indians most of all." He shook his head. "As for Jack, they suspect, but they have no proof. Yet. They were here," Ahanu volunteered. "Mr. Jack hid us and sent them away." The doctor exchanged glances with his sons. "When was this?" "February," Juanetta supplied, "during the last big storm." "That explains it," the younger son, Benjamin, spoke for the first time. "Aldridge returned, raving about Morgan acting suspicious, said he'd go back when the weather cleared." "Which it's doing now," Thomas added grimly. Juanita's mind raced with implications. Jack had risked himself once for them. If Aldridge and his men returned in force, with explicit suspicions, rather than general hunting fervor, the outcome might be very different. "We should leave," she said decisively. Today, the trails to the north are clearing. We can reach the Seneca settlements within a week. In mud season, with a child. Doc Harris shook his head. You'd be lucky to cover 5 miles a day, and that's assuming Aldridge's men don't pick up your trail. What alternative do we have? Juanetta demanded. Wait here for them to return? Place Jack in further danger? The doctor studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, as he registered the genuine concern in her voice, not just for herself and Ahanu, but for Jack. You care for him, he observed quietly. Juanita did not deny it. What would be the point? This perceptive man had already seen what she herself had been reluctant to acknowledge fully. My wife and I have a proposal, Doc Harris said after a thoughtful pause. Our home is on the outskirts of Harshest, isolated enough for privacy, close enough to town for protection. We have a room above the surgery that few people know exists. It was built as a recovery space for patients who needed extended care. He glanced at his sons, who nodded their agreement. You and your son could stay there until we arrange safe passage north. The offer was unexpected, its generosity so at odds with what Juanetta had come to expect from white settlers that suspicion flared automatically. Why would you risk this for strangers? You're not strangers, Doc Harris corrected gently. You're Jack Morgan's guests, and Jack hasn't accepted a guest since he lost Sarah and Elizabeth. He smiled slightly. Besides, my wife is a quarter Seneca herself. Her grandmother would haunt me for eternity if I turned away a woman and child in need. Before Juanita could respond, the cabin door swung open once more. Jack stood on the threshold, arms laden with the results of his successful hunt. 2 rabbits and a fox, their pelts already removed and bundled separately. His expression shifted from satisfaction to wary alertness as he registered the unexpected gathering in his home. Doc, he greeted cautiously. Thomas, Ben, this is a surprise. For us as well, Jack, Doc Harris replied, extending his hand. Seems you've had quite a winter. Jack set his burden down and clasped the offered hand, his gaze moving between the doctor and Juanetta, assessing the situation. I take it introductions have been made? And then some, Doc Harris confirmed. We were just discussing your guest's future plans. Jack's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Were you now? Juanetta recognized the defensiveness in his tone, the instinctive protection of what he had come to consider his responsibility, perhaps even his family. The doctor has been kind, she intervened. He's offered us shelter in Harshest until passage north can be arranged. Harshest, Jack repeated, his expression darkening. The same town that burned their village and hunts them still? The same. Town where my surgery has a hidden room that not even Aldridge knows about, Doc Harris countered calmly. The same town where I have connections to get messages north to the Seneca settlements without raising suspicion. It's too dangerous, Jack insisted, moving further into the cabin to stand near Juanetta and Ahanu, a subtle but clear statement of allegiance. If they were discovered, if they stay here, they will be discovered, Thomas interjected bluntly. Aldridge is gathering men for another search once the trails are fully clear. This time they'll come with warrants and the authority to search every building on your property. Jack's jaw clenched, his gaze dropping to Ahanu, who stood watching the adults with solemn attention. They're safer here, he maintained, though with less conviction. Jack, Doc Harris said gently, you know I wouldn't suggest this if I didn't. Believe it was their best chance. Margaret and I can protect them in ways you can't, with legitimate alibis, with normal comings and goings that don't raise suspicion, with connections to people who can help them reach their people safely. And what about Jack? Ahanu asked suddenly, his clear child's voice cutting through the tension. If we go with you, what happens to him? The simple question held layers of meaning that silenced the room. In the space of a few months, this boy had lost his father, his home, most of his tribe. Now he was being asked to leave behind the man who had become a surrogate father, a protector, a friend. Jack crouched before Ahanu, his large hands gentle on the boy's shoulders. "I would be fine," he assured him. "I've lived alone in these mountains for years." "But you wouldn't be alone anymore," Ahanu argued, with a child's devastating logic. "You'd be alone again, and sad again." Jack's expression flickered, vulnerability breaking through his usual stoicism. He glanced up at Juanetta, a question in his eyes that he didn't dare voice aloud. "There is another option," Doc Harris suggested, quietly, watching this exchange with perceptive eyes. "One that would require significant adjustments from all involved." "What option?" Juanetta asked, though something in her already knew what the doctor would propose. "Come spring, Jack's ranch will need rebuilding if he's to make a go of it again. No man can do that alone." Doc Harris looked between Jack and Juanetta meaningfully. "A family, on the other hand—" "Doc," Jack interrupted, his voice rough with suppressed emotion, "you can't be suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing," the doctor replied mildly, "merely observing that a widow from back east, who happened to be of mixed heritage, say Seneca and French, might not raise too many eyebrows if she were to marry a lonely rancher in need of a wife, especially if that rancher's closest neighbor and oldest friend vouched for her character." The proposition hung in the air, breathtaking in its audacity, its implications. Juanetta stared at Doc Harris, then at Jack, whose expression had frozen into unreadable stillness. Such an arrangement would be— She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Complicated? Life is complicated," Doc Harris shrugged. "Doesn't mean it can't also be good." "It would mean giving up your plan to rejoin your people," Jack said quietly to Juanetta. "Giving up your identity in some ways." "Not giving up," she corrected thoughtfully. "Adapting, evolving." She looked down at Ahanu, who was watching her with hopeful understanding beyond his years. "We would still be Mohawk in our hearts, in our private words, in the stories we tell, but we would also be something new." "It wouldn't be easy," Jack warned. "Even with Doc's story, there would be those who'd question, who'd resent." "Has anything been easy?" Juanetta challenged gently. "Since the day we met, has any part of this journey been without risk or difficulty?" A ghost of a smile touched Jack's lips. "No," he admitted, "not one day." "And yet here we are," she said simply. Doc Harris cleared his throat. "This isn't a decision to be made lightly or quickly," he advised. "Margaret and I can take Juanetta and Ahanu to our home today, give them safe harbor while you both consider the possibilities. If you decide against it, we'll still help arrange passage north when the time is right." Jack looked to Juanetta, the conflict clear in his eyes, desire for them to stay warring with concern for their safety and respect for their autonomy. "It should be your choice," he said finally. "Yours and Ahanu's." Juanita appreciated this more than she could express, that even now, with his own wishes obviously pulling him in one direction, Jack would not presume to decide for her. It was this respect, as much as anything, that had drawn her to him over the long winter months. "We will go with Dr. Harris today," she decided. "It is the safest immediate course, and it will give us all time to think clearly, without the fear of discovery hanging over us." Jack nodded, acceptance masking disappointment. "I'll help you gather your things." "Jack," she added, touching his arm lightly, "this is not a goodbye. It is only a pause, a breath between words in a story that is still being told." His eyes met hers, and in them she saw understanding, hope, and something deeper that neither of them was ready to name aloud. "I'll hold you to that," he said softly. The preparations took less than an hour. Juanetta and Ahanu had few possessions beyond what Jack had provided them, and those were quickly bundled into saddlebags. Doc Harris offered his own horse for Juanetta. and a Hanu to ride, planning to join Thomas on his mount for the journey back to Hawk Rest. As they prepared to depart, a Hanu approached Jack with solemn purpose. From his pocket, he withdrew a small wooden carving, a horse that Jack had whittled for him during the long winter evenings. "Keep this safe for me," the boy requested, pressing it into Jack's large palm. "Until I come back for it." Jack swallowed hard, closing his fingers carefully around the carved figure. "I will," he promised. "It'll be waiting right here along with everything else." Juanita stepped forward, her own goodbye lodged painfully in her throat. There were too many things to say, too many emotions to express in the brief moment they had before parting. In the end, she simply placed her hand over his, where it clutched the wooden horse. "Thank you," she said, the simple words carrying the weight of all that remained unspoken between them. "For everything." Jack's free hand covered hers, warm and strong. "Come back," he replied, the two words both plea and promise. She nodded, unable to trust her voice further. Then, gathering her resolve, she turned and allowed Benjamin to help her mount the doctor's horse, settling a Hanu before her in the saddle. As they rode away from the cabin, Juanita resisted the urge to look back. To do so felt too much like an ending, and this, she was determined, would not be their end. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the trail ahead, where melting snow revealed patches of earth awakening with the first tentative shoots of spring. Behind them, a single figure stood watching their departure, his hand closed around a carved wooden horse, his heart carrying a hope. He had thought long dead until a winter storm had brought an unexpected gift to his door. And between them stretched a promise, unspoken but binding, that this separation was but a necessary pause in a story still unfolding, a story of two worlds colliding and finding against all odds a way to become one. The Harris home stood on the outskirts of Hawk Rest, a two-story, clapboard structure painted a dignified white with green shutters. Unlike the other dwellings clustered near the town centre, it was set back from the main road, partially obscured by a grove of ancient maple trees that were just beginning to show the first signs of budding life. Dr. Harris had designed it this way deliberately, close enough to be accessible to patients in need, distant enough to provide both privacy and a buffer against the sometimes overwhelming intimacy of small-town life. The front half of the ground floor served as his surgery and dispensary, while the family's living quarters occupied the rear portion and the upper story. Except, as Juanita and Ahanu soon discovered, for a hidden section of the second floor that could not be seen from the exterior of the house. "My father built it during the war," Margaret Harris explained, as she led them up a narrow staircase concealed behind what appeared to be a linen cupboard. "He was part of the Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves reach Canada." The silver-haired woman, whose keen eyes and strong features suggested her Seneca heritage despite her predominantly European appearance, smiled faintly. "Some habits of secrecy become family traditions." The hidden room was small but comfortable, a single window, strategically placed to catch light while remaining invisible from the ground, illuminated a space furnished with a bed, a small table, with 2 chairs, a washstand and a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes. A small coal stove in the corner provided both heat and a means to cook simple meals. "It's not spacious," Margaret acknowledged, "but it's secure. The only people who know of its existence are myself, Jonathan, our sons, and our daughter Rebecca, who lives in Albany now." Ahanu approached the window cautiously, peering out at the unfamiliar vista of Hawkrest in the distance, a collection of wooden buildings, a church steeple, threads of smoke rising from chimneys. This was the settlement whose men had destroyed his home, killed his people, hunted him and his mother through the wilderness. Now it would be their sanctuary, at least temporarily. The irony was not lost on Juanita, who stood watching her son. With a mixture of concern and pride, He had adapted to so many changes, faced so many hardships, yet still approached each new situation with curiosity rather than fear. Would this resilience persist? Or would there come a breaking point? "Thank you for this kindness," she said to Margaret, who was busily filling a water pitcher from a bucket she had carried up the narrow stairs. "We will try not to disrupt your household." Margaret set down the pitcher and turned to Juanetta, her direct gaze reminiscent of her husband's. "My grandmother would have called you sister," she said simply. In her world, there was no greater obligation than to provide shelter to those in need, especially family. "We are not family," Juanetta pointed out gently. A knowing smile touched Margaret's lips. "Jonathan told me about Jack," she said, "about how he looks at you and you at him, about the boy who has brought laughter back to a house where joy died with Sarah and Elizabeth." She waved her hand, dismissively, so perhaps not family by blood or law yet, but family nonetheless. Before Juanetta could respond to this surprisingly frank assessment, footsteps on the hidden staircase announced the arrival of Dr. Harris. He carried a tray laden with bread, cheese, and sliced apples, their first meal in Hawkrest. "The boys have gone back to their homes," he informed them, setting the tray on the small table. "Less suspicious that way. They'll spread word that I've been called to a difficult case in the western foothills, explaining my absence earlier today and any comings and goings in the next few weeks." "Is such subterfuge necessary?" Juanetta asked, watching Ahanu eagerly eye the food. "Surely in your own home." "Hawkrest has eyes everywhere," Margaret interjected, her tone matter-of-fact rather than paranoid. "A small town's greatest strength and weakness is that little goes unnoticed. We must be cautious, not careless." Dr. Harris nodded agreement. "I've sent a message north with a trader, I trust, inquiring about Mohawk survivors who might have reached the Seneca settlements. It will take time for a response, but it's a start." He glanced at Juanetta. "Unless you've reconsidered Jack's situation." "I need time," Juanetta replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions the question evoked. "We both do." "Of course," Margaret said, shooting her husband a reproving look. "No one should rush such decisions." She turned to Ahanu skillfully, changing the subject. "Now, young man, I understand you've been learning to read English. I was a teacher before I married the doctor. Perhaps we could continue your lessons while you're with us." Ahanu looked to his mother for permission, his eyes bright with interest despite the exhaustion of the day's journey. At her nod, he smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness since they had left Jack's cabin. "Yes, please," he said politely. "Mr. Jack was teaching me about horses in books. He said maybe someday I could have a real one." An unexpected pang shot through Juanetta's heart at this casual revelation. Ahanu had never mentioned this particular conversation with Jack, this promise of a future together that they had apparently discussed when she wasn't present. How many other such moments had there been? How deeply had the bond between man and boy grown during their winter seclusion? Dr. Harris must have noticed her reaction, for he said gently, "Jack was a natural father to Elizabeth. It was what he was meant to be, I think, before fate intervened." "As was being a husband to Sarah," Juanetta observed, unable to keep a hint of uncertainty from her voice. "Yes," the doctor agreed thoughtfully. "But grief, when it's allowed to heal, doesn't diminish our capacity to love again. It expands it." He smiled slightly. "At least, that's what Margaret's grandmother used to say." His wife nodded, her expression softening. "She was a wise woman, and she would have liked you, Juanetta." She gestured to the tray of food. "Now eat, both of you. Tomorrow we can discuss more practical matters." After the Harrises departed, leaving them to settle into their hidden sanctuary, Juanetta sat beside Ahanu on the narrow bed, watching as he devoured bread and cheese with the appetite of a growing boy, too long accustomed to limited rations. "Are you comfortable here?" she asked, smoothing his dark hair back from his forehead. "It's very different from Jack's cabin." Ahanu considered. This, chewing thoughtfully. "It's nice," he decided, "but temporary." Juanetta smiled at his perception. "Yes, it's temporary, but we may be here for some weeks while Dr. Harris arranges our journey north. Or while you decide if we're going back to Jack," Ahanu added with the directness of childhood. He set down his half-eaten apple, suddenly serious. "I want to go back." "I know," Juanetta acknowledged, choosing honesty over evasion. "But it's complicated, Ahanu. Jack is white. We are Mohawk. Our people may have survived. We might find them again." "Jack saved us," the boy countered. "He taught me things. He made—" You smile again. His dark eyes, so like his father's, met hers steadily. "Doesn't that make him our people too?" The question, so simple, yet containing multitudes, caught Juanetta off guard. From the perspective of a child who had known both the warmth of tribal belonging and the intimate connection of their winter refuge, perhaps the distinctions that seemed so insurmountable to adults were merely artificial boundaries. "It's not that easy," she tried to explain. "There would be difficulties, prejudices, like the men who burned our village," Ahanu interrupted. "But not everyone is like them. Dr. Harris isn't. Mrs. Harris isn't." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Jack isn't." Juanetta pulled her son close, pressing her cheek to his hair. "No," she agreed softly. "Jack isn't." And that, perhaps, was the crux of her dilemma, the exception that challenged every assumption, every boundary she had constructed between us and them. That night, lying beside Ahanu in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the distant sounds of a settlement preparing for sleep, Juanetta found her thoughts returning constantly to the cabin in the mountains, to the man who stood alone watching them. Right away, his hand closed around a carved wooden horse and a promise. Meanwhile, in that very cabin, Jack Morgan sat before the dying fire, turning the small wooden horse over in his calloused hands. The silence that had once been his constant companion now felt oppressive, accusatory, as if the very walls of the cabin were asking why he had allowed Juanetta and Ahanu to leave when their absence hollowed him out like a lightning-struck tree. But what alternative had there been? Doc Harris was right. Aldridge and his men would return, this time with the authority to search every corner of his property. And even if they managed to hide once more, what kind of life would that be for Juanetta, and especially for Ahanu? Always in fear, always in hiding, never free to live openly under the sun. And yet, Jack set the wooden horse on the mantel where it stood as a sentinel, a reminder of what had been and what might yet be. Then he rose, decision crystallizing into action as he crossed to the chest at the foot of his bed. From it, he withdrew a small leather pouch, all that remained of his savings after the disastrous cattle venture that had nearly cost him everything. It wasn't much, but it might be enough for what he had in mind. The following morning, Jack saddled his horse before dawn and rode toward Hawkrest, not directly but circuitously, approaching from the west as if returning from the high country rather than his cabin to the east. He had no desire to encounter Aldridge or his followers on the road, not when so much depended on secrecy and timing. He reached town as businesses were opening, hitching his horse outside the general store with its newly painted sign, Hawkrest Mercantile and Sundries, Esther 1865. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, drawing the attention of the proprietor who was arranging bolts of fabric on a shelf. "Jack Morgan," Samuel Green greeted with genuine surprise. "Haven't seen you since before the first snow, beginning to think you'd frozen solid up in those mountains." Jack forced a smile, aware that his presence in town would be noted and discussed. Better to appear normal, engaged in ordinary business. "Takes more than a little cold to finish me off, Sam. Just been busy with repairs after those January storms took down half my outbuildings." This was a plausible explanation for his absence. Storm damage was a common affliction throughout the region. Samuel nodded sympathetically, accepting the excuse without question. "What can I get for you today?" he asked, moving behind the counter. "Got a new shipment of tools last week, saws, hammers, that sort of thing. Might be useful for those repairs." "Actually," Jack said casually, "I'm looking for something different. A ring, if you have any." Samuel's eyebrows rose in undisguised surprise. "A ring? Like a wedding ring?" Jack managed not to flinch at the direct question. "Something simple but well made," he confirmed. "Gold, if you have it." The storekeeper studied him with unconcealed curiosity. "Didn't know you were courting anyone, Jack." "There's a lot you don't know about me, Sam," Jack replied mildly. "Do you have what I'm looking for or not?" Samuel held up his hands in a placating gesture. "No offense meant, just surprised is all." He reached beneath the counter and withdrew a small wooden box. "Got these in from Albany last month. Not many call for fine jewelry in Hawkrest, but occasionally someone gets engaged or married." The box contained half a dozen rings of varying designs, all simple, appropriate for a frontier community where ostentation was neither practical nor particularly valued. Jack examined them carefully before selecting a narrow gold band with a subtle pattern of leaves etched around its circumference. This one, he decided, the imagery seeming appropriate for Juanita, whose connection to the natural world was so intrinsic to her being. Samuel quoted a price that made Jack inwardly wince, but outwardly remain impassive. It would take nearly all his remaining savings, but some things transcended practical considerations. As Samuel wrapped the ring in a small square of cloth, tucking it into a wooden box no larger than a walnut, he remarked casually, "Town's been buzzing about those Indians they tracked up toward your land back in February. Aldridge is convinced some got away from the Eagle Ridge business." Jack kept his expression neutral with effort. "Is that so?" Samuel nodded, handing over the small package. "He's been gathering men for another search once the trails dry out completely. Says he's got authority from the mayor this time." He leaned forward slightly. "Between you and me, most folks think he's obsessed. Waste of time and manpower when we should be focusing on spring planting and rebuilding after the winter." This information, offered seemingly as casual gossip, was actually valuable intelligence. Jack filed it away carefully, nodding as if only mildly interested. "Aldridge always did have a particular dislike for Indians," he observed, "ever since that land dispute with the Seneca. Still," Samuel continued, accepting Jack's payment for the ring, "might want to be careful up at your place. Aldridge isn't known for asking nicely before he barges in somewhere." "I appreciate the warning," Jack said sincerely, pocketing the ring box. "Anything else I should know about while I'm in town?" Samuel seemed pleased to be treated as a source of important information. "Well, Doc Harris has been called away to some complicated case in the western foothills. Been gone since yesterday. And Pastor Matthews is organizing a town meeting next week to discuss expanding the schoolhouse." He paused, then added with a hint of genuine concern, "Oh, and Jack, watch yourself with Aldridge. He's been saying some ugly things about you. Sympathizing with savages. Nonsense, of course, but the man carries grudges like other men carry pocket watches." Jack thanked him for both the ring and the information before making several other purchases, practical items that would justify his trip to town in the eyes of any observers. Flour, coffee, ammunition, seeds for spring planting, all normal acquisitions for a man preparing to rebuild his homestead after a harsh winter. As he loaded his purchases onto his horse, he scanned the street carefully. Hawkrest was beginning to stir with morning activity. The blacksmith's forge already glowing, women gathering at the small market area to exchange produce and gossip, children running errands before school. It all seemed so ordinary, so civilized. Hard to reconcile with the fact that many of these same people had either participated in or tacitly accepted the destruction of an entire village and the hunting of its survivors. Evil, Jack reflected as he mounted his horse, rarely announcing itself with horns and fanfare. More often it arrived in the guise of everyday concerns, justified by fear or convenience or tradition. The step from "they are different" to "they are dangerous" to "they must be eliminated" was a shorter path than most people cared to admit. He rode out of town the same way he had entered, circuitously, making a show of heading west before doubling back toward his cabin once he was certain no curious eyes followed. The small box containing the ring pressed against his chest where he had tucked it into his inner pocket, both a weight and a promise. In Hawkrest, Juanetta stood at the hidden room's window, watching the town in the distance with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. She had been to white settlements before, trading expeditions with her father and later her husband, necessary interactions at frontier outposts, but never had she dwelled within one, observing its rhythms and patterns like an unseen ghost. Ahanu sat at the small table with Margaret, engaged in reading lessons that seemed to delight both teacher and student. The boy's facility with language, not just English but concepts across tongues, impressed the former schoolteacher, who had remarked to Juanetta that Ahanu possessed a natural gift that should be nurtured. "Your son could walk in both worlds," Margaret had observed. "With proper education he could bridge gaps that others cannot cross." The observation lingered in Juanetta's mind as she watched Hawkrest awaken to the new day. Would Ahanu truly be able to walk in both worlds, or would he forever be caught between them, never fully belonging to either? Was that a gift or a burden to bestow upon a child? A movement in the street below caught her attention, a familiar figure on horseback, riding out of town. Even at a distance, she recognized Jack immediately, the set of his shoulders, the way he sat a horse, as if born to it, the deliberate economy of his movements. Her heart quickened inexplicably, even as confusion furrowed her brow. What was Jack doing in Hawkrest? Has something happened? She resisted the urge to call Margaret's attention to this development, instead watching silently as Jack disappeared from view beyond the town's western edge. Only when he was gone did she turn back to the room, her expression composed despite the questions tumbling through her mind. "Ahanu is a quick study," Margaret was saying, with obvious pride in her voice. "He's already reading at the level of children much older." "His father valued learning," Juanetta replied, joining them at the table. "He traded furs for books whenever possible, even when others in our village thought it foolish." Margaret nodded approvingly. "A wise man. Education is the key that opens doors between worlds." She glanced out the window toward the town where Jack had just been. "It's what allowed my grandmother to survive when her people were pushed further. West, what helped my mother marry, whom she chose despite disapproval from both sides." Juanita considered this lineage of women who had navigated the boundaries between cultures, each finding a way to preserve what mattered while adapting to changing realities. Was this to be Ahanu's path as well? Her own? A soft knock at the hidden. A doctor interrupted her reflections. Dr. Harris entered, carrying both breakfast and news. "I've received word from my contact among the Seneca," he announced without preamble. A small group of Mohawk did indeed reach their settlement before winter. Set in fully, about 20 souls, mostly women and children, with a few elders. Juanita's breath caught in her throat. "Did they name names? Is my sister among them?" The doctor's expression softened with genuine regret. The message didn't include specific identities, only numbers and general conditions. The runners who carry such information must memorize it rather than risk written evidence that could be found by hostile parties. Hope and disappointment warred within Juanetta's chest. Her people, some of them at least, had survived, but whether Kinex and her baby were among them remained unknown. There's more, Dr. Harris continued, setting down the tray of food. My contact believes it would be safe to attempt a journey north within the next 2 weeks, once the spring mud has hardened somewhat. He can arrange guides from the Seneca to meet you at a designated location and escort you the rest of the way. 2 weeks. The time frame hung in the air, suddenly making abstract considerations concrete. In 14 days, Juanetta would need to decide, north to her people or back to Jack, and the possibility of a new life entirely. The weight of the choice pressed against her chest, constricting her breathing. Also, Dr. Harris added, his tone deliberately casual, I saw Jack in town this morning. Juanetta looked up sharply. I saw him too from the window. Is something wrong at the cabin? Not that he mentioned, the doctor replied. He was at the general store making purchases. Quite ordinary ones for the most part. A hint of amusement touched his features, though I doubt he'd consider a gold ring an ordinary purchase under normal circumstances. A ring? Juanetta repeated, not immediately comprehending. Margaret shot her husband a reproving look. Jonathan, really? You shouldn't have told her that. Why not? Dr. Harris asked innocently. It seems relevant to the decisions being contemplated. Juanetta's mind raced, piecing together the implications. A gold ring. Jack in town despite the risk of encountering Aldridge. The significance was unmistakable, yet almost impossible to believe. He bought a wedding ring? She asked directly, needing confirmation. Dr. Harris nodded. A simple band with leaves etched into the gold. Rather pretty, actually. I happened to be in the store myself when he made the purchase. His expression turned serious. Jack Morgan is not a man who acts on impulse or without certainty, Juanetta. If he bought that ring, he's made his decision. But that doesn't mean you must make yours based on his actions, Margaret interjected firmly. A woman's choice should be her own, freely made. Juanetta looked to Ahanu, who was listening to this adult conversation with intense concentration, clearly understanding far more than they might have assumed. What do you think, my son? She asked quietly. Should we go north to find our people, or become Jack's family? Ahanu finished for her. He didn't hesitate. I want to be Jack's family, but I also want to know if Aunt Connex is alive. He frowned, the complexity of the situation challenging even his straightforward perspective. Can't we do both? It was such a simple question, yet it illuminated possibilities Juanetta hadn't fully considered. Must the choice be permanent, absolute, or could there be a middle path, a way to honor both the past and the future? Perhaps, she said slowly, we could journey north first, confirm whether your aunt and cousin survived, and ensure our people know we are alive. And then, she paused, the next words both frightening and exhilarating to speak aloud. And then we could return, to Jack, if that's truly what we both want. Dr. Harris nodded thoughtfully. A compromise with wisdom at its core. Learn what you need to know, then decide with a clear conscience. He glanced at his wife. What do you think, Margaret? I think, the older woman replied with a smile, that Juanetta's grandmother would be proud of such a balanced approach. Honor the past, embrace the future, and most importantly, choose your own path rather than having it chosen for you. Outside, the spring sun climbed higher in the sky, illuminating Hawkrest with unforgiving clarity, its strengths and its flaws, its capacity for both cruelty and kindness. In a hidden room, above the doctor's surgery, a Mohawk woman stood at a crossroads between worlds, considering not just her own future, but her son's, and that of a solitary rancher who had risked everything to save them from a merciless winter. In her mind's eye, she saw Jack riding back toward his lonely cabin, a small wooden box containing a golden band tucked against his heart. A question, a hope, a possibility that defied the boundaries both their worlds had established. And for the first time since fleeing her burning village, Juanetta felt something unfamiliar, yet unmistakable, unfurling in her chest. Not just hope, which had sustained her through the darkest moments, but genuine anticipation for what lay ahead. The appointed day dawned clear and mild, a perfect spring morning that seemed to mock the gravity of what lay ahead. 2 weeks had passed swiftly in the hidden room above Dr. Harris's surgery. 2 weeks of planning, preparation, and increasingly pointed conversations about futures and pasts that refused to be neatly reconciled. Juanita stood before the small mirror on the washstand, studying her reflection with critical assessment. Margaret had provided clothing that would attract less attention during their journey. A simple dress of brown homespun, a woolen shawl, sturdy boots that pinched Juanita's feet, but would serve better than moccasins on the muddy trails ahead. Her hair was braided and coiled at the nape of her neck in a style that Margaret assured her was common among settler women. The disguise was convincing enough, she supposed. At a casual glance, she might pass for a half-breed trader's wife, especially with her command of English. But the eyes that stared back at her from the mirror remained unmistakably Mohawk, dark, watchful, carrying memories that no amount of settler's clothing could erase. Behind her, Ahanu fidgeted with the collar of his new shirt, uncomfortable with the stiff fabric, but bearing it without complaint. He too had been transformed by Margaret's careful attention, his long hair trimmed shorter, though not as short as white boys typically wore it, his Mohawk clothing replaced by trousers and a jacket that made him look both older and somehow diminished, as if parts of his spirit had been tucked away, along with his traditional garments. "Are you ready?" Juanita asked softly in their language, a private moment between them, before they must step into a world where even their words would need disguising. Ahanu nodded solemnly. "Will Jack meet us before we go?" The question revealed his primary concern, not the journey north, not the uncertainty of what they might find, but whether he would see the rancher one last time before departing. "Dr. Harris sent word," Juanetta confirmed, adjusting her shawl. "Jack will meet us at Dawn Creek, away from town, where it's safer." Relief softened Ahanu's features. In the 2 weeks since they had left the cabin, the boy had spoken of Jack daily, recounting stories and lessons from their winter, together with a vividness that suggested each memory was being carefully preserved against the possibility of permanent separation. A gentle knock at the door announced Margaret's arrival. The older woman entered, carrying a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Provisions for the journey," she explained, handing the package to Juanetta. "Bread, cheese, dried meat. Enough for 3 days, which should get you to the meeting point with the Seneca guides." Her keen eyes assessed their appearance with approval. "You look the part," she declared. "Jonathan is waiting with the wagon. We'll depart through the back way, before most of the town is stirring." The back way proved to be another of the Harris family's secrets, a narrow track behind the property that wound through a stand of trees before emerging well outside Hawkrest's boundaries. Dr. Harris waited there with a covered wagon, his expression a mixture of professional composure and genuine concern. "The story, should anyone inquire," he reminded them, as he helped Juanetta and Ahanu onto the wagon bed, "is that I'm transporting my half-Seneca cousin and her son to meet relatives at the northern trading post. Simple, plausible, and close enough. To truth that the details won't tangle us up." Margaret embraced Juanita briefly but warmly. "Whatever you decide," she whispered, "know that you have friends in Hawkrest. Not just us, but others who would stand against hatred if given the chance." The farewell was necessarily brief. Lingering would only increase the risk of discovery. As the wagon pulled away, Juanetta felt a curious doubling of emotion. Relief at leaving a town whose shadow had hung over them since the burning of their village, and unexpected regret at parting from the Harrises, whose kindness had challenged her perception of what was possible between their peoples. The journey to Dawn Creek took most of the morning, following winding trails that Dr. Harris selected for both ease of passage and minimal chance of encounter. The spring landscape was a revelation after so many months of winter's austerity. Hillsides dusted with wildflowers, trees hazed with the first green of new leaves, streams swollen with snowmelt, rushing over rocks with exuberant energy. Ahanu observed it all with wide-eyed attention, occasionally pointing out a hawk circling overhead or a deer vanishing into the underbrush. His excitement grew visibly as the wagon approached a bend in the trail where the burbling sound of Dawn Creek could be heard through the trees, and there, waiting at the agreed meeting place, stood Jack Morgan. He had dressed with unusual care, Juanetta noticed immediately. His beard was trimmed, his clothes clean if worn, his stance betraying both eagerness and uncertainty as the wagon approached. Beside him, 2 horses were tethered to a low branch, his own mount and a smaller, gentler-looking mare that Juanetta had never seen before. Dr. Harris brought the wagon to a halt, setting the brake before jumping down to greet his old friend. "Right on time," he observed, clasping Jack's hand. "Any trouble on the road?" Jack shook his head. "Quiet as a church." "On Monday," he confirmed. His gaze moved past the doctor to where Juanetta and Ahanu sat in the wagon bed, and something in his expression softened. "You look well," he said simply. Before Juanetta could formulate a response, Ahanu scrambled over the side of the wagon and ran to Jack, formality forgotten in the excitement of reunion. Jack crouched to meet him at eye level, his large hands steadying the boy's shoulders with a gentleness that made Juanetta's throat tighten. "I kept your horse safe," Jack told him, gesturing to the carved wooden figure visible in his shirt pocket. "Just like I promised. And I practiced my reading," Ahanu replied earnestly. "Mrs. Harris says I'm very good." "I don't doubt it," Jack said with a smile that transformed his usually solemn features. He glanced up at Juanetta, still in the wagon, then back to the boy. "I have something to show you," he added, leading Ahanu toward the 2 tethered horses. "Doctor." Harris helped Juanetta down from the wagon, his expression thoughtful as they watched Jack introduce Ahanu to the smaller of the 2 horses, a dappled mare with a white blaze down her forehead. The boy's exclamation of delight carried clearly across the clearing. "He bought that mare from Winters over at the South Farm," the doctor remarked. "Gentle as a lamb, trained for children, cost him nearly as much as the ring, I'd wager." Juanetta felt a peculiar constriction in her chest. "The horse is for Ahanu?" "So it appears," Dr. Harris confirmed, "though whether it's a parting gift or—" He let the implication hang unfinished between them. Jack was lifting Ahanu onto the mare's back now, showing him how to hold the reins properly, his instructions delivered with the serious attention. One warrior might offer another. The boy sat tall in the saddle, his face alight with pride and joy, the expression of a child who feels seen, valued, understood. "I should give you 3 some privacy," the doctor decided, moving back to his wagon. "I'll water the horses downstream and return in an hour. That should give you time enough." He hesitated, then added with uncharacteristic emotion, "Juanetta, whatever you decide, know that you have made my old friend happier these past months than I have seen him since he lost his family. That alone is a gift beyond measure." With that, he led his wagon team down a path that followed the creek, leaving Juanetta alone with the tableau of Jack and Ahanu and the patient mare who stood quietly under the boy's inexperienced guidance. Juanetta approached slowly, her borrowed boots crunching on the gravel beside the creek. Jack turned at the sound, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the small distance, a man and woman from different worlds, bound by circumstances neither could have imagined months before. "Her name is Willow," Jack said, breaking the silence by nodding toward the mare. "On account of how she likes to nibble willow branches whenever she gets the chance." "She's beautiful," Juanetta acknowledged. "Ahanu looks natural on horseback." He does, Jack agreed, his gaze lingering on the boy who was now carefully guiding the mare in a small circle, his concentration absolute. Like he was born to it. Weighted silence fell between them, filled with everything that needed saying and the hesitation that prevented either from beginning. Finally, Jack reached into his pocket and withdrew something small that caught the sunlight, a wooden box no larger than a walnut. "I wanted you to have this," he said quietly, extending it toward her, "before you go north, so you'll know where I stand, whatever you decide." Juanita accepted the box, its polished surface warm from being carried close to his body. She opened it carefully to reveal the gold band nestled inside. Slender, elegant in its simplicity, with delicate leaves etched around its circumference. "It reminded me of you," Jack explained, watching her face closely. "Strong but beautiful, part of the natural world, but crafted into something that could last generations." The ring glinted in the spring sunlight, both a question and a declaration. Juanita closed the box gently, not in rejection, but in acknowledgement of complexities that could not be resolved in this moment beside Dawn Creek. "Jack," she began, searching for words adequate to the magnitude of what lay between them, "I need to know if my sister survived, if my nephew lives. I cannot build a future without reconciling the past." She met his gaze directly. "Can you understand?" "That?" His expression remained steady, without a trace of the disappointment he must surely feel. "I'd think less of you if you didn't need to know," he said simply. "Family is family, Juanita. I'd never ask you to choose between what you owe your blood and what might be between us." Relief washed through her at his understanding. So different from what she had experienced with white men before, who seemed to expect native women to abandon their heritage, their connections, their very selves, when crossing the boundary between worlds. "The Seneca guides will lead us to their settlement," she explained. "If my sister is there, if she and her child survived—" She hesitated, then continued with determined clarity. "I must speak with her, ensure she is well, that she understands. Why I would return south rather than remain." "Return south," Jack repeated, the words careful as if testing their weight. "Then you've decided?" Juanita glanced to where Ahanu continued to guide the mare in increasingly confident circles, his face alight with the simple joy of mastering a new skill. "Ahanu has," she said softly. "He speaks of little else but returning to the cabin, to you. And I—" She paused, gathering courage for honesty. "I find myself looking forward rather than back, imagining possibilities I never thought I would consider." Jack's expression remained guarded, hope visibly warring with the caution of a man who had learned the high cost of lost dreams. "What possibilities?" he asked quietly. Instead of answering directly, Juanita posed a question of her own. "If I return, if we return, what kind of life would it be? Not just the practical aspects, but would Ahanu be free to know his heritage, to speak our language, to honor the ways of his father's people?" "I would have it no other way," Jack replied without hesitation. "What value is there in asking a child, or anyone, to cut away parts of themselves to fit someone else's notion of what they should be?" His voice strengthened with conviction. "I don't want to change you, Juanita. Either of you. I want to build something new alongside you, something that honors where we've all come from while creating a future none of us could reach alone." The sincerity in his voice, the clarity of his vision, resonated deeply. This was not a man offering charity or compromise, but genuine partnership, each bringing their whole selves to the endeavor of creating a shared life. "The talk in town," she pressed, needing to be certain he understood the challenges ahead. "The prejudice we would face." Jack's expression hardened slightly. "Some folks will talk regardless of what we do. Others will come around once they see we're just living our lives, harming no one. And those who can't accept it? He shrugged. Their narrow minds are their own punishment. Dr. Harris mentioned a story about me being of mixed Seneca and French heritage, Juanita noted. Is that how you would explain to me? Us? Only if necessary for safety, Jack clarified. Within our home, you would be exactly who you are. A Hanu too. No pretense, no hiding. He glanced toward the boy, who had now dismounted and was feeding Willow an apple with flat palm, just as Jack had shown him. Children shouldn't have to lie about who they are to please others. Neither should the woman I hope to marry. The directness of this last statement, not a formal proposal, but an unambiguous declaration of intent, caught Juanita off guard. She had known, of course, from the moment she saw the ring, but hearing it spoken aloud made it suddenly, vividly real. Jack, she said softly, I cannot promise until I've completed this journey, until I know my sister's fate, until I've fulfilled my obligations to my people. She held up the small wooden box. But I will keep this safe until I return. And if you still want me, then want us, I will have an answer for you. It was not the commitment he had hoped for, she knew, but it was honest and in its way more valuable than a hasty promise made while looking backward over one's shoulder. Jack seemed to understand this, for he nodded once, decisively. I'll be waiting, he said. Then, with a half-smile that softened his features, he added, the cabin needs a woman's touch anyway. The place is a mess without you. This unexpected touch of humor, so rare from the typically solemn rancher, broke the tension between them. Juanita found herself smiling in return, a lightness rising in her chest despite the weight of the journey ahead. A Hanu rejoined them, leading Willow carefully by her reins. Mr. Jack says Willow will stay at the cabin until we come back, he announced, clearly having no doubt about their eventual return. He says she'll be waiting for me, and I can ride her every day when we live there. Juanita and Jack exchanged a glance over the boy's head, a Hanu's certainty, both touching and concerning in its absoluteness. What if they reached the Seneca settlement only to discover compelling reasons to remain? What if her sister needed her? What if the Mohawk survivors were planning to rebuild, to reclaim their ancestral lands? Willow will be well cared for, Jack assured the boy, crouching once more to his level. And when you return, she'll be yours completely. That's a promise. Ahanu nodded solemnly, accepting this covenant between them with the gravity of one who understands the binding nature of promises. Then, with the quick emotional shifts of childhood, he asked brightly, Can I show Mother how I can guide Willow? All by myself? Jack helped him remount, and for the next quarter hour, Juanita watched as her son demonstrated his newly acquired skills with the patient mare. Jack stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool spring air, yet not touching, respecting the boundaries she had established until her return. You've been good for him, she observed quietly. I haven't seen him this animated, this confident, since before the village was burned. He's a remarkable boy, Jack replied. Quick to learn, eager to help, brave beyond his years. He paused, then added with quiet intensity, he deserves a future where those qualities are valued, not punished. The implication was clear. In a world increasingly hostile to native peoples, a mixed heritage child would face particular challenges. Without the protection of tribal communities or white legitimacy, a Hanu would be vulnerable from all sides, unless he had both. A mother who could teach him the ways of his ancestors, and a father, for that was what Jack was offering to become, who could help him navigate the realities of a changing frontier with both principle and pragmatism. The thought sent a frisson of possibility through Juanita, not just for a Hanu's sake, but for her own. A life with Jack would not be without difficulties, but it would offer something she had not dared hope for since the attack on her village. A future with both roots and wings, both heritage and horizon. The hour passed too quickly. Dr. Harris returned with his wagon as promised, his expression questioning but respectful as he approached the small group by the creek. "The Seneca guides will be expecting you at Hunter's Rock by nightfall," he reminded them gently. "If you're to make that rendezvous, we should depart soon." Reality reasserted itself with these practical considerations. Juanita tucked the small, wooden box containing the ring securely into the pocket of her dress, its weight both comforting and challenging against her hip. The farewells were necessarily brief but laden with emotion. Jack helped Ahanu from Willow's back one last time, accepting the boy's impulsive hug with visible emotion. "Remember what I taught you about the stars," he said, his voice slightly rough. "They'll guide you home if you ever lose your way." "I remember," Ahanu assured him seriously. "The North Star stays still while all the others move around it, like how our cabin stays still while we go on a journey." Jack smiled at this interpretation, ruffling the boy's dark hair affectionately. "That's right," he agreed. "Some things remain constant no matter how far we travel." When he turned to Juanita, however, words seemed to fail him. They stood facing each other for a long moment, the spring breeze stirring loose strands of her hair, carrying the scent of wildflowers. "And possibility. I'll be here," he said finally simply. "Whatever you decide." Juanita nodded, unable to trust her voice. Then, in a gesture that surprised even herself, she leaned forward and pressed her lips briefly, gently to his. A first kiss that was also a promise, a possibility, a future glimpsed but not yet grasped. Before he could respond, she turned and allowed Dr. Harris to help her onto the wagon beside Ahanu. As they pulled away, following the northern trail that would lead to their rendezvous with the Seneca guides, she did not look back. To do so would be to risk what remained of her resolve, to be pulled between what she owed the past and what beckoned from the future. Beside her, Ahanu waved until Jack was no longer visible through the trees. Only then did he turn to his mother, his expression serious beyond his years. "We will come back," he stated, not a question but a declaration. "Won't we?" Juanita drew him close, pressing her cheek to the top of his head. "We will try," she promised. "First, we must find Aunt Kinex, if she lives. We must honor our obligations to our people." She pulled back slightly to meet his gaze directly. "But yes, if all is well with them, if they do not need us urgently, we will try to return." This measured response seemed to satisfy Ahanu, who settled against her with the comfortable weight of trust. He understood in his child's way the delicate balance his mother was attempting to maintain, between heritage and future, between blood ties and chosen family, between the world that had shaped them and the one they might yet create. As the wagon continued northward, spring unfurling around them in a riot of new green, Juanita found her thoughts returning to that cabin in the mountains, to the solitary man who stood waiting, holding not just a carved wooden horse and a promise, but perhaps also the key to a future neither of them could have imagined before a winter storm had brought them together. The small wooden box pressed against her hip, its contents capturing the sunlight that filtered through the trees above. Gold, and warmth and possibility, waiting for her decision. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.